Joey. Mine works. But whether yours works is more important.
Woo. Pig. I think it's working.
He obviously knows we're head up against the Razorbacks Oklahoma State baseball game right now. But it's a great crowd in spite of that, and we're glad that all of you are here. Thank you so much for being here. And Skip is the mask police, so you've all got your mask on. That's good. We appreciate that tonight. Shane Broadway is here. Where are you, Shane? Shane's in the back. I want to call out Shane because we're co-sponsoring this with Shane's group, the Political Animals Club. So thank all you political animals for being here, and thanks, Shane.
Political animals.
And Skip Rutherford, I guess, is the founder of the Political Animals back in the early 80s, mid 80s, 30s. Judge Buddy Valline says it was the 1930s. So Skip is do a special thanks here because it's his relationship with Jonathan that brought Jonathan here, and they lined this up even before Jonathan's book had come out. And we're very fortunate to have him because the book has been all the rage. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. It'll be difficult to, if you've been looking on national cable or podcasts, it has been impossible the last 30 days to find any of those that didn't have Jonathan or his co-author Alex Burns own them to interview. I actually heard both of you on Hacks on Tap with David Axelrod and Mike Murphy. And since he agreed to this, I discovered, I told him when he came in that he knows about half of Little Rock, so he's no stranger here. And I discovered that only,
just the heights.
Only because when I would contact people and alert them he was coming, they'd say, oh yeah, he's already called me, or he's emailed me, I know he's coming. So it's clear that he's been steeped in Little Rock for quite a while. Since 2013, Jonathan's been a national political correspondent for the New York Times. Before that, he was with Politico. I think the first time I saw you here at the Clinton School, you were with Politico. And he's a native of Virginia who now lives in New Orleans, where Skip tells me that he does indeed follow the SEC now that he's in New Orleans.
Go Tigers.
And he has a rising sophomore daughter at TCU. Any Horned Frogs here?
Frogs. There go Frogs. Frogs up.
So even if you hadn't read the book by now, you've likely heard references to one or more scoops. The most notable that I hope someone will ask him about if Jonathan doesn't volunteer to tell us concerns that audio recording he and Alex secured the January 10, 2021 phone conversation between the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Congresswoman Liz Cheney, where they discussed McCarthy's plan to call up President Trump to urge him to resign. A plan McCarthy lied about when it was first reported, the story broke, but then Jonathan or his publisher or the Times or somebody produced the tapes. I'm also curious, was there an Oval Office conversation you had with the President Trump, when there was a phone call in with Lindsey Graham? And
oh yeah, we can go into that.
All right.
Yeah.
Tell us about that in a minute. Let me just set the tone with a couple of quotes from reviews of the book.
Sure.
The Washington Post says this will not pass, charts the path of two parties and two presidencies at a moment when the democratic system in the United States was becoming increasingly fragile, when in fact Trump and his allies in the Republican Party were increasingly committed to dismantling it. George Packer in the Atlantic several weeks ago said that Jonathan and Alex are tireless reporters, and the book's impact lies less in any headline revelations than in the accumulation of small details that can almost seem routine, but that reveal the deeper condition of American democracy. And Packer thinks that condition revealed by these tireless reporters is not very good. In fact, he writes the book is a document of decline and fall, a chronicle that should cause future readers to ponder how American leaders in the early 21st century lost the ability and will to govern. Step back from the page-by-page account of congressional Republicans desperate grasping for Trump's favor or the Biden administration's struggle to pass its legislative agenda, you're confronted with a world of almost unrelieved cowardice, cynicism, myopia, narcissism, and ineptitude, where the overriding motive is the pursuit of power. So I hope you can help us come back from that
On that
break.
happy note.
Tell us you didn't mean for people to draw that darker conclusion, but thank you for coming to Little Rock, and we're so glad you're here.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
Let's give Jonathan Martin a warm Central Arkansas welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks for moderating. Thank you to the Political Animals. Thank you to Central Arkansas Library. And 2 shout-outs before we begin. Skip Rutherford's in the audience, who was the maestro of putting this together. And Skip and Billy had an anniversary this past weekend, I understand. So happy anniversary to Skip Rutherford. And I think Andrew DeMillo with the AP is here. Happy birthday to Andrew, wherever you are. There he is. The great AP correspondent here in Little Rock. So, please.
So let me also.
Who am I forgetting? Yeah.
We have the former governor of Arkansas here, Jim Guy Tucker.
Governor Tucker, thank you for being here. And I think Rodney Slater is here as well. Former Secretary of Transportation. Mr. Secretary, thank you. Appreciate it. I've flown quite a few times back and forth between D.C. and Little Rock over the years, and I've seen Secretary Slater on that flight more than once. So it's good to be back in Little Rock once again. So we set out to do a book that we thought was going to be an account of the 2020 campaign. That was basically the idea with Simon & Schuster. And then, as you know, as 2020 went on, there was this cascade of extraordinary events, culminating in the election itself and President Trump not conceding in that election. And then, of course, January 6th took place. And I think even after the election, it became pretty clear that we had to do a more comprehensive account of political history rather than just one more campaign book. And then after the 6th, it became really clear that a campaign book was going to be insufficient to the moment. That, you know, we've all read those campaign books and they're fun and like I enjoy them just as much as the next person. But the idea that, you know, an argument between staffers about, you know, whether or not to buy TV ads in Tampa versus Philadelphia, like not the most important question in this period in American history. And we just didn't want to spend that much time in our lives sort of doing that kind of a book. And we told Simon & Schuster that we thought we had to go bigger, and they were very supportive. And so what we set out to do with this was to just try to do the first draft of history of this stress test of American democracy, 2020 and 2021. Not just a campaign book, but also not just a book about government. A book about the president, but not just President Trump, President Biden too. And frankly, not just a book about Washington, but a book about governors and mayors, all levels of government. And I think that's what we tried to do with this book. It took us a little longer to do, and we came out obviously later than we planned. But I think by doing that, we were able to capture Biden's entire first year as president, and we were also able to capture the aftermath of January 6th in both parties and sort of chart how that shaped both parties in a way that I think was important, because I think January 6th is a really a central event in modern American history, and it's not something that we thought was merely the kind of thing that should be tacked on as an epilogue, and a hurried one at that. So that's what we came up with. And you know, obviously, it's not a Hollywood ending. There is no sort of happy ending. The title kind of betrays that. It's "This Will Not Pass." This is not just about yesterday. This is very much a current story. This is about today and certainly tomorrow in American politics. And one of the challenges was knowing where to end the story. We knew where to begin it. We start in March of 2020 because 2 things happened that month. Biden gets the nomination, and then COVID lands on American shores. So that was kind of an obvious place to begin. The more challenging thing was, how do you stop and where do you end when you're covering history in real time? And we basically decided to sort of end January, February of 21, this year, I'm sorry, 22 rather, this year, so we can capture all of Biden's first year. And that's what we were able to do. The McCarthy tapes obviously got a lot of attention, and we could talk about that, but you know, half the book is on 21 and on Biden's first year in office, and we sort of capture that in full too.
Is there anybody who hadn't familiarized yourself with the McCarthy tapes? You might tell them a little bit about that
absolutely.
setting.
So we have an author's note at the beginning of this book. and we feel strongly about this, that we really wanted to capture what we believe is a seminal moment in modern political history. And we want to do so with authority and want to capture these conversations, these meetings, these calls with rigor, not based upon 6-month-old memories and dim memories of conversations that took place with reconstructed verbatim paragraphs based on memory alone, because that just didn't seem to us to sort of meet the moment. So when we have quotes in here in conversations, it's either based on contemporaneous notes or it's based on audio recordings. And this is an important point. You know, the development of the iPhone has dramatically changed reporting and writing and books. Because now people are empowered to record conversations in a way that you can capture a meeting or a call as it happened, not sort of a couple of paraphrases, quotes here and there, but the actual verbatim conversation. And during COVID, that was certainly the case when most everything was Zoom or on the phone. And so we have a series of audio recordings from some of these most sensitive, delicate conversations among congressional Republicans and some Democrats too, different recordings. But with the Republicans before and immediately after January 6th. And the McCarthy tape that you mentioned captures the leader of the House GOP, perhaps the Speaker of the House next year, racked with anxiety because January 6th has just taken place. He's desperately worried about the political ramifications for the Republican Party, but he's also concerned about the more immediate specter of political violence and additional political violence and his own members inciting it. And so the McCarthy on this call is desperate to get Trump out of office. And it's not like they're, it's a call with the House GOP leadership. So it's about the top half dozen members of the House GOP. And it's not like McCarthy is like grappling with whether Trump was, guilty or not of inciting the riot. It's much more brass tacks. It's how can we get Trump out of office? 25th Amendment, no, that'll take too long. Could we call him to resign? And obviously he says at one point, I'm going to call Trump and tell him to resign. That's one option too, to get him out of office. And then finally they realize that the Democrats are going to lead the impeachment inquiry, and that's probably where this is going to go. But in that moment, they're just sort of grappling with, this is a clear and present danger both physically and politically to us. How do we get Trump out of office before January 20th, which is extraordinary to think about given the subsequent rowback in the weeks and months after among people like Kevin McCarthy, who have obviously re-embraced President Trump with gusto now. But in those hours, there was desperation and there was fear about what Trump was going to do to the party and potentially the country.
Is everybody taping everybody now in D.C.?
We hope so, yeah. I mean, that's, no. As reporters, we certainly approve of that. No, look, I think, there's a reason why this is an audience of political junkies, I presume. Like, you've heard those Nixon
One or
tapes
two.
or the LBJ tapes. I mean, that's fascinating history. And those were tapes that the presidents themselves set up. We could have used some of those tapes during the Clinton presidency. It would have been fascinating in some moments then as well. So it's different, obviously, now. It's easier because of the iPhone. Look, I still think it's obviously a very sensitive matter, but boy, for the purposes of history, it is vivid.
So one of the themes in the last 5 years, 6 years, lose track, was that there was a private assessment of the former president by people in his party, and then there was the public consumption.
Yes.
Does that contribute to, well, first of all, what's your reading of that? How true is that? What's your sense of that? And second of all, does that have anything to do with the apparently widespread recording of everybody on the phone?
So it's a really important point. This is one of the recurring themes of our book, and that is this gap between the public and the private assessment of former President Trump and everything surrounding him among Republican leaders, right? And for 7 years now, we've all heard these stories, these anecdotes of, if you only heard what the Republicans really think about Trump in private, boy, they just can't stand the guy. And, I think what the value of this book, and certainly the recordings, it captures precisely what those conversations are. It's not a matter of speculation anymore. It's on tape. We know what they think of him, and we know how desperate they were to extract themselves from him after January 6th. I can't recall a moment in political history, at least modern history, when a political party was so divided between its elites and its grassroots in terms of its views of the leader of the party. Especially in the Senate. The House is a little different because I think Trump does have some real admirers in the House GOP. The Senate, though, there's very few people there who would like Trump to be the nominee again. And that's what we sort of capture in this book is just how different these folks act when they're talking amongst themselves and they don't know that the cameras are there or the tape's rolling. And that's the Republicans. But Democrats have a similar challenge, too. There's also a gap between what Democrats will say in private and what they'll say in public. And we have a series of memos in this book that Biden's chief pollster would send him every week and he's still sending him, by the way, starting when Biden takes office. His name is John Anzalone. He's Biden's longtime pollster. And Anzalone would send these weekly polling memos, a combination of public survey data and private data, and sort of do summaries and sort of telling Biden and his inner circle what they should be thinking about. And from the spring of 21, really early days, Anzalone is warning Biden about crime, about immigration, and yes, about inflation. And, the Biden inner circle is getting these warnings, and they're pretty stark. And again, we have this in the book, we have all these memos in hand, and they don't necessarily act on it, in part because, well, they know those were challenges in private, but if you do that in public, then you create some tensions within your coalition. And Biden and his people are very uneasy about creating tensions in the Democratic coalition. So in both parties, you have this reluctance to sort of project in public what you certainly believe in private.
So is the country ungovernable because of some of these things that you're describing? How long have you been in D.C.?
I grew up across the river in Arlington.
As a reporter, I guess, as a correspondent.
Yeah, 20 years, yeah.
Has there been noticeable deterioration in the...
Yeah, I think the challenge we have now is that all the incentives in our political system are geared towards more partisanship, and they reward polarization. And before you ask, yes, the media is partly culpable.
How so?
Because we reward bombast and provocation and extremism, and people know that they can get attention by lighting their hair on fire. And that pays off more than like quietly putting together, a coalition to get a bill passed or to, make sure that you get money for a bridge back home or something. That's just not nearly as glamorous and sexy, right? So that the structural challenges now are real. There's a lot of people in D.C. and Congress who are serious actors who I think, whether they're conservative or liberal, are there to do a job and policy oriented, but they're overshadowed obviously by the provocateurs, and Trump was the biggest one of all. We have a lot here. Speaking of Arkansans, on Steve Womack, who I know represents.
He's caught on tape too.
Mr. Womack. I don't know how many folks in this room know Mr. Womack because he's from Northwest Arkansas.
Everybody in Arkansas knows everybody.
Okay, well, fair enough. All right. So
Arkansas is a small town.
Right, I've heard that. Was that Rex Nelson line? Yeah. So Steve Womack, as you know, then is a military man. He's got a military bearing. He's a very sober, serious person. And we interviewed him and discovered that he had undisguised contempt for Kevin McCarthy's leadership, particularly in the aftermath of January 6th. Why? Because Kevin McCarthy refused to hold members accountable for what they did leading up to and on the 6th. this is not just what President Trump did. There was a member of Congress named Mo Brooks from Alabama, and some of you may know Mo Brooks because he's now running for the Senate. Trump endorsed him and then famously unendorsed him. Whole different story. But
He's now in the runoff.
what's that?
He's now in the runoff.
He's now in the runoff with Katie Britt to succeed Richard Shelby in Alabama. So Mo Brooks on the morning of January 6th is at the ellipse before Trump speaks. And Mo Brooks is similarly inciting the crowd. And he says something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, go up there and kick some ass, telling members to go to the Capitol and kick some ass.
And he's wearing a Kevlar vest, right?
Yes. And so Womack is appalled by this conduct, and Womack expects that there will be accountability for Mo Brooks. And there is a committee in the House Republican Conference. It's called the Steering Committee, and basically it's a couple of dozen members who dictate what committees folks are going to sit on. And so it's a pretty important committee because they have that power. And so Womack's on the Steering Committee. And he uses the first steering committee meeting after January 6th to play for all his members on the steering committee, all Republicans. It's a private meeting. The video of Mo Brooks saying what he said on January 6th, go up there and kick some ass. And afterwards, he says, we have to hold him accountable. We have to strip him of his committee assignment. All right? McCarthy says, hang on, we'll get to that. Let's not do that now. Let's not use this meeting to be punitive. We'll sort of bridge that down the road. Well, of course, down the road never happens, and McCarthy just punts it. And Womack realizes that there's not going to be accountability for Mo Brooks. And so Steve Womack, who down the line, this is not a boat rocker, this is not a maverick, this is somebody who's pretty loyal conservative member from Arkansas, writes a blistering letter of resignation to Kevin McCarthy and resigns from the steering committee, which is a pretty prestigious committee, saying, I don't want to be on this committee anymore that's doling out committee assignments if we're not going to hold members accountable. And Steve Womack, to his credit, revealed all of this on the record and sort of bears his soul, and I think was thrilled to have the chance to talk about it for the first time. And that's all in the book. And that's the great part about doing a book, by the way. You just never know what you're going to get, and you never know who's going to say it. I mean, if you had told me going into this book that, yes, Steve Womack from Arkansas is going to reveal his barely disguised contempt for Kevin McCarthy and Kevin McCarthy's lack of leadership, I would have been shocked, but that's what the reporting took us to. And not a huge detail, but a pretty revealing one in that moment. And I think speaks to the doubts about Kevin McCarthy, by the way, among otherwise conservative rank-and-file members of the House GOP.
So those votes to elect the leader of the caucus or the conference take place in private, right?
Yeah, and then the vote for speaker will go to the floor for a public vote in both parties. But yes, the initial vote in the parties is private.
So if Representative Womack's contempt for McCarthy were shared by 50% plus one of the Republican conference, McCarthy wouldn't be the speaker.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think today McCarthy is still in a strong position to be Speaker of the House, in part because you gotta beat somebody. You can't beat somebody with nobody, and it's not clear right now who the alternative would be. And McCarthy's really worked it hard, and frankly, he's poised today to pick up quite a few seats. And these freshman members are going to owe him for his involvement in the midterms. But we'll see what happens. I mean, President Trump obviously relishes having McCarthy as sort of his plaything, if you will. And I think, McCarthy is beholden to the former president in a way I just can't recall a congressional leader being so beholden to another politician, especially a former president. But that's where McCarthy is right now. I mean, when that tape came out, McCarthy, swiftly called Trump and tried to make sure that they were okay. And of course, Trump gave him absolution because Trump likes the idea of somebody apologizing and trying to. He's got him in his hand. And we'll see how long that lasts. I mean, look, Paul Ryan, John Boehner were both effectively driven out of the House because they couldn't manage that caucus. So we'll see what it's like for Kevin McCarthy.
So let's move around. What's your assessment, based on the book and your reporting, your sources, of the minority leader in the Senate and the Democratic majority leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell?
Yeah. So Look, I think Democrats have had a real challenge governing this year, in part because they just don't have the majority, right? I mean, it's hard to execute on FDR or LBJ agenda when you have 50 votes in the Senate, and 2 of them are Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. So clearly they have a math challenge, but I think they also have a challenge that owes to Biden never fully deciding whether or not he wanted to be the transformative, progressive, New Deal president, or kind of the healer-in-chief, the consensus-oriented friend of Mitch McConnell who could sort of bring the country back together. I think it's sort of hard to do both of those.
I think the Post review says that the one you just described, the healer-in-chief, was impossible, and the other was unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think he never really picked one, though. I mean, I think he sort of had aspirations to do both. I mean, this is Biden, and folks in this room have watched him throughout his career. You know, he wants to be liked, and I think he covets.
What politician doesn't?
It's shocking, I know. But I think Biden really is somebody who, you know, he said on the campaign trail famously that after Trump, the Republicans in Congress were going to have an epiphany. And, you know, his advisors in private would kind of roll their eyes at that. But I think Biden, I mean, as recently as 2 weeks ago, Biden was praising Mitch McConnell and said that McConnell is a person of goodwill. And he really wants to make this system work. The most revealing, this is, I think, probably a little too late for the book, but the most revealing Biden moment was earlier this year when he goes to Atlanta and gives a blistering speech about voting rights. And he basically says to Republicans, look, do you want to be George Wallace or do you want to be John Lewis, right? I mean, Bull Connor, John. I mean, it was tough, right? And McConnell goes to the floor of the Senate and sort of gives it right back to him. This is a disgraceful speech. The next day, Biden's back in Washington. He's in the Capitol, and he goes to McConnell's office and tries to find McConnell to try to make things right. And that's Biden for you, right? I mean, like one day he's sort of a traditional partisan leader who's trying to get his agenda passed. The next day he's trying to sort of make things right with his old colleagues. He's a man of the Senate, right? And he still wants to make that Senate of yesteryear happen today, and it's damn tough for all the reasons that we're talking about earlier. And I think so Biden has struggled because of that. He's never come to terms with who he wants to be. You know, Bill Clinton was the New Democrat. He was clearly somebody who was, as he said, a different kind of Democrat. And he was fairly unapologetic about that. And that's how he governed. It's certainly how he governed after 1994. Joe Biden was never fully in that DLC camp. He's always kind of been wherever the center of gravity is in the party. So in the 90s, yeah, he was sort of broadly associated with the sort of Clintonism, but that's never really been him. And I think up to today, he's never really chosen which camp to be in. Some of his advisors are more progressive, others are more moderate. Biden has not put himself in either camp. We have this scene in the book where in October of last year, Nancy Pelosi is desperate to try to move the infrastructure bill and then immediately try to get the larger Build Back Better agenda passed. And she cannot get her progressives to go out on a limb and vote first for infrastructure. And they call in Biden. Biden's about to fly to Rome to see the Pope. And they call in Biden first before he goes to Andrews. And he goes to the basement of the Capitol. And the mission is clear. You got to ask them for the vote. We need your vote. You got to get the progressives off the fence. And Biden won't say it. He will not explicitly say, I need your vote today on this, AOC or Pramila Jayapal. He just won't do it because he just can't do it. And Pelosi's infuriated because then Pelosi, after Biden leaves and goes to the airport, has to step in and make the ask for him. But it isn't the same coming from the speaker because the president's the president. But Biden, in that moment and throughout so much of the first year, he won't take sides.
What's the book's portrayal of the minority leader, Mitch McConnell?
So I think McConnell and McCarthy are different, and I think it's important to sort of capture their differences and their similarities. And one of the things that we went into this book thinking is that, you know, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden are pretty well sketched out political figures in American life, at least among people who follow politics. But we really wanted to capture Kevin McCarthy more vividly because Kevin McCarthy is not somebody who's that well known, even to the hardiest political junkie out there. And so I think what you need to know about Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell is McCarthy comes to Washington in 2006, and it's the last 2 years of the Bush presidency, and he's a freshman. Nobody's really, interested in him in the last 2 years of the Bush presidency. And so for much of his congressional career, he's serving under a Democratic president, two-term Democratic president. And of course, Barack Obama has no use for Kevin McCarthy. So it's not until 2017, when Trump is president, and McCarthy's now been in the House for 10 years, that McCarthy finally gets to see the trappings of the presidency. Air Force One, Camp David, the West Wing, and in Trump's case,
M&Ms.
And Mar-a-Lago. And so here's Kevin McCarthy. He's in the room, he's at the table, he's there for it, and it's heady stuff. And he's posting pictures of himself on Air Force One on Instagram, right? Here I am, I'm at Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump Jr. and Kimberly Guilfoyle. And for somebody who's a kid from Bakersfield, California, who had served in Sacramento first, by the way, in the State House with Arnold Schwarzenegger, got a taste of celebrity there and liked it. And he loved the idea of rubbing elbows with famous people. So here's a famous person as president, Donald Trump, and he's bringing me, Kevin McCarthy, into the fold. And I think McCarthy is rhapsodized by that. It also helps that Kevin McCarthy's rank and file in the House are similarly taken with Donald Trump, and even more taken with the trappings of power, because most of them only served under Barack Obama too, so it's their first time also on Air Force One. You cannot underestimate that with politicians. There's some in this room, I won't mention names, Clark Tucker, but they're human. They like having their egos. They like the idea of the President of the United States knowing their names and their wives' names and including them at Camp David, which is why it drove Democrats crazy that Obama never did that in 8 years. Anyways, and Clinton loved doing that, by the way. I mean, Clinton could have done it for hours and hours and hours. Playing hearts till like 5 in the morning with Lloyd Benson or whatever. And that was his, a good time. So this is Kevin McCarthy. Now, Mitch McConnell comes to the Senate in 1984. He served with presidents of both parties, all right? He's been on Air Force One. He's been in the Oval Office, all right? He's not posting pictures on Instagram. He doesn't know what the hell Instagram is, all right? That's a little too tough. He's heard of it, okay. But TikTok, he wouldn't know what that is. And Mitch McConnell wants to do two things, all right? He wants to obtain and hold power, that's number one. And number two, he wants to generally promote a center-right agenda in American politics, all right? And so he sees Trump as basically an embarrassment at best, but somebody who he's got to tolerate because
he gives his wife a job in the cabinet.
Well, there's that too. But he can get conservative judges appointed, and he can get broadly conservative bills passed. And so for 4 years, McConnell tolerates Trump, and his wife gets a nice job, right? But he's never sort of buddy-buddy, and he's always at some remove. And privately, he's obviously very disparaging of President Trump. It's hard to think of two people in American politics more temperamentally different than Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. I can assure you Donald Trump is not spending his evenings reading biographies of Henry Clay, all right? Mitch McConnell is. But
what do you think he is reading?
Donald Trump? He's watching a lot of cable. He's reading Chyrons. So by January 6th, Mitch McConnell has wrung everything out of the towel, right? He's gotten 3 Supreme Court justices from a one-term president. Amazing by itself, by the way. He's gotten a sweeping tax cut, all right, for corporations and individuals. So, McConnell has tolerated this guy, and sort of used him for his purposes. But then 2 things happen. January 5th, McConnell loses his majority, which, again, number one, that's his top priority, keeping power. So Trump has effectively driven away McConnell's majority because of those 2 seats in Georgia. That's January 5th. Then January 6th, Trump incites the riot in the Capitol, which desecrates the seat of government, which McConnell has deep, deep affection for. McConnell came to the Senate as an intern in the summer of 1964, and he's revered the institution and everything. He never wanted to be president. McConnell always wanted to be Senate leader, all right? So on the night of January 6th, late, probably after midnight, so technically the 7th, I was in the Capitol. And McConnell had polio when he was a kid. He actually convalesced at Warm Springs when FDR was down there with Lucy Mercer. So McConnell has a hard time walking downstairs because of his childhood polio. So McConnell always takes elevators downstairs. And I knew the elevator that McConnell typically comes out of in the Capitol. And so it's like 1 in the morning, and I'm there in the Capitol, and I know where he's coming. And so I just stayed there, and sure enough, the elevator opens, and McConnell walks out of the elevator. And so before I could even get a word out to McConnell, he beckons me and says, step into this doorway. He says, what are you hearing about the 25th Amendment? Because in that moment, McConnell's looking for intelligence. He's trying to figure out, is there going to be the political will among, yes, Trump's own cabinet to drive him from office? Because the day was just that jarring for everybody in Washington. And I told him what I had heard, and I quickly then asked McConnell, because I obviously wanted to get his reaction. He's not the kind of person that you ask how they're feeling. Like, if you think of all the sort of Barbara Walters type targets, putting Mitch McConnell on the couch is not something I would typically do. But I said, well, Senator, how are you feeling? How does today make you feel? Kind of a weird question, but in that moment, it kind of made sense. And McConnell said, I'll never forget this, he said, I feel exhilarated. I said, exhilarated? That's a weird thing to say. And before I could even follow up, he said, Trump put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger, and he's now totally discredited himself. Because in that moment, McConnell and McCarthy, everybody in the GOP thought, this is it. There's no way that he will ever come back from this. And in a lot of ways, it was like Access Hollywood, that tape that came out in the fall of 2016. There was this assumption that this has got to be the one. And so McConnell walks out that early morning the next day, January 7th, into the evening, and believes that the Trump era is emphatically over. I got my judges, my tax cut, but this guy is now discredited himself forever, and we as a party can move on. And obviously, that's not what happened.
So what if they had acted decisively and taken either the path of the impeachment that was looming for that episode or the 25th Amendment? Where would we be now?
So the 25th is more complicated because, the cabinet people that would have been supportive of it, people like Elaine Chao, McConnell's wife, or Betsy DeVos, they resigned immediately after the 6th. So, and then Trump would have resisted, it would have gone to the courts, and then come back to Congress. The timing, actually Kevin McCarthy was right. It would have taken too long. But you raise a really important question, and this is one of the great historical unknowns, the what if. What if McConnell sticks to his guns and rallies the Senate Republicans?
He only needs 17 of them.
And tries to find 17 Republicans. Can McConnell, with all of his persuasive power, and with all the Republicans who are not going to run again in 2022, 24, 26, if you add those people up, and then you include people like Romney, Murkowski, and Collins, who are the kind of mavericks, can McConnell find 17? And it's one of the great questions that we'll never know the answer to, because McConnell decided that he didn't want to use his capital to try to do that. But if he had, and you get 17, you then vote immediately after the conviction to bar that person from ever seeking office again. And that would have emphatically ended Trump's career in politics.
So based on your reporting, do you think there are any people regretting that they didn't go down that path now?
Yeah, I do. We have this thing in the book where Liz Cheney, this is probably the summer of 21, she says if it was a private ballot in the House, it would have been overwhelming. But, it's not a private ballot. So there were 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, and now some of them have decided not to run again, and others are facing tough primaries. So we interviewed Trump in April of 21, and this is the Lindsey Graham thing. You mentioned Lindsey Graham earlier. So Alex, my co-author, who, by the way, sadly couldn't be here tonight, but is a great guy and sends his best. He and I went to Mar-a-Lago in April of 21 to interview President Trump, then former President Trump. And this is just 3 months after Trump has left office. And what was striking about it was just how much he had happily returned to his old life. So he schedules the interview at 4 p.m. Why? Because in South Florida at 5:15, when the interview is wrapping up, there's something called the early bird special going on. And we're in Trump's club, Mar-a-Lago. It's an active private club. And so at 5:15, the early birds are coming in. And the reason that Trump wants you there is because the interview is taking place in the lobby of Mar-a-Lago, intentionally, because Trump wants his guests, his members, I should say, to see him being interviewed by reporters, because Trump thinks that'll convey to the members, hey, I'm still a player, I'm still relevant, these guys. To witness the kissing of the ring from the members, because that'll convey to us, oh, Trump still has this huge following and this allegiance. So the timing was striking. But what was really fascinating was just how easily Trump returned to major domo mode, de facto maitre d'. And I'm not kidding here. People were coming in, they were setting up the buffet line, and Trump is basically saying, folks, it's Thursday, it's prime rib night, it's fantastic tonight. We got some green beans on the side over here. And by the way, the soup is just excellent as well. He's like welcoming people to his club. Like nothing has changed. And happily, with no shame at all. Like, you had nuclear codes a half an hour ago, and now you're like pushing prime rib.
He sounds like he's infinitely better at that job than the one he had.
So it was an amazing scene. But that was not the most amazing part of the trip. That was when Lindsey Graham called Donald Trump's cell phone. So most people, if they get a cell phone call, they either send it to voicemail or they excuse themselves and they step out to a different room, take the call. So pretty standard. So when Trump's cell phone rings during the interview, he does neither of those things. Instead, he answers it, puts it on speakerphone, and says, hey, Lindsey, and holds the phone up to both of us, and doesn't tell Lindsey Graham that he's there with two reporters. And so Lindsey Graham was like talking out of school for the first, 5 minutes of the conversation. And they're talking shop about, I think they were trying to get Herschel Walker into the Senate race in Georgia. And so Graham is reporting back, oh, Mr. President, we almost got him. He's in a good place. This is going to be great. You know, we got him close. And it's like sort of fun inside politics gossip, but it's not like a huge deal. But Alex and I are just sitting there wondering, like, holy shit, is he ever going to tell Lindsey Graham that we're sitting here? And eventually Trump says, hey, Lindsey, I got these two guys here from the New York Times talking to me for their book, Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns. And you can like hear on the cell phone, like, okay, that's Lindsey's, happy to hear that now.
He's trying to remember what he just said.
Exactly. But Trump's not done. And Trump tells Lindsey Graham, now that I got you and you know these guys are here, Lindsey, tell them about how important my endorsement is in these primaries. And so Trump is basically telling Lindsey, let's go, And of course, Lindsey, and he just steps right up and says, fellas, let me tell you something. I've been in politics now for 40 years. I have never seen anybody with this kind of juice in our party. This is bigger than Reagan. I mean, Lindsey's so good at this, And so like Lindsey sort of just swings and like it's a grand slam. But Trump's not happy. Trump's smiling, holding the phone up like this, he's like doing one of these deals. But then Trump says, hey, Lindsey, tell him about my golf game. Because that's what obviously counts, right? And so like Lindsey, again, gets the hint immediately. And it's like one of these late night infomercials where it's like, look, I didn't believe these protein pills were real, but I've been taking them the last week. I'm a new man, It's like, Lindsey says, fellas, I thought it was all bullshit too, all right? I couldn't believe he was that good. And then I played with him. And let me just tell you something. He is a remarkable golfer and the best golfer. He was just laying it on thick. And so Trump couldn't be happier. I finished the interview, we get back in the car. We call Lindsey back in the car. All right, he's gone now. And Lindsey said, yeah, Trump's a great conversationalist. Pause. When it's about him. But that tells you, look, it's funny, and obviously to be there in that moment was wild, and it's all in the book, by the way. But, which is available here today. You buy it tonight. Speaking of selling,
yes, we're going to go to commercial here shortly.
But it does tell you something bigger too, which is just the fealty that a lot of the Republicans felt the need to publicly express toward Trump, and obviously had a very different view of him in private.
I'm not sure you walked me back from the George Packer window ledge, but let's let people ask questions here in the room.
Yeah, I mean, there is no happy ending here to this book necessarily, and it's still very much a real challenge, how we can sustain a democracy in a moment where we're in this period of maximum polarization. It's not easy. Wish I had an easier answer. Yeah, who had questions?
Microphones on either aisle. So while people are deciding they want to ask a question, let me ask you one more. The title, I think I heard you say, works on a lot of levels.
Yes.
Tell us.
Sure. So
obviously the one that we've been discussing mostly is that we're not going to be rid of this scourge anytime soon. But what are the other levels?
You know, the gallows humor among Democrats in Congress is that this will not pass refers to Build Back Better.
That's what I thought.
Joe Manchin, if you're listening. But no, the broader purpose though is, we're living through a moment of tribalism in this country and our politics that it's hard to see how we get out of this. I mean, look, most crises in the history of this country have brought people together, at least temporarily. And COVID had the exact opposite effect. It just dug the political divide deeper. It pushed people to their corners, red and blue, mask and no mask, vax or no vax. I mean, it almost immediately, it just was one more log on the burning fire of our political polarization. It's pretty damn depressing, but that's kind of where we are right now. And
so you mentioned Manchin. What's your reporting tell you about the relationship, the state of that relationship between President Biden and Senator Manchin?
So I think Biden had a hard time and has a hard time with Kyrsten Sinema. We report in the book that it was kind of like with Biden and his grandkids' TikTok. He just didn't totally get it. He kind of understood why they liked it, but he didn't totally. I think Biden has never really figured out Sinema, and some obviously others haven't either. But I think Biden was a little bit over his skis on Manchin. I think Biden thought, I know Joe and I can do business, and I thought
I've been hanging out on Almost Heaven, or houseboat.
And like Joe's an old West Virginia Democrat, I serve with Byrd, and I can do business with that kind of a guy. And Biden probably overestimated his powers of persuasion. But look, if Biden had taken yes for an answer from Joe Manchin in the summer of 2021, Joe Manchin put on paper, in fairness to Joe Manchin, what he would support in Build Back Better and gave it to Chuck Schumer. And they knew what he would support, and it was less than what Pelosi and Biden and Schumer wanted, and so they pushed for more. But if they had taken yes for an answer in the summer of 21, they could have gotten 50 votes, including that of Joe Manchin. I think once inflation, Afghanistan, and Ukraine popped up, Manchin was looking for an excuse to say no, but in the summer of 21, he did offer a way to yes, and I think that Biden and his people thought that they could do more. One fascinating thing in the book that not many people know, for a period at the end of 21, Nancy Pelosi took over the Joe Manchin account from Chuck Schumer, which is pretty extraordinary in Washington, where there's sort of respect between the two chambers, and for Pelosi to effectively take over Manchin, Schumer said he was okay with it. I think Schumer thought, you can give it a try for a while, but it tells you a lot about how
knock yourself out.
Yeah, exactly, how desperate Pelosi was to get Manchin to yes. Here's what people don't realize. Joe Manchin's family name is Giuseppe Mancini. Joe Manchin is an anglicized name. Manchin's an Italian Catholic, and his people came over from Sicily, and so Pelosi thinks, speaking of, I can do business with Joe Manchin. He's a paisan, And so Pelosi tries to sort of do the Italian Catholic thing with Manchin and talks about her dad and the church.
Baltimore.
Oh, Baltimore, all of that, right? And plays every card she has, and it's obviously not enough. But here it is, like mid-June, and we're still talking in Washington about Joe Manchin maybe supporting a bill, so who knows what's going to happen here.
What's your reporting suggest about whether he's going to run for re-election? One of the podcasts I've heard you on, you suggested he might be running for president?
Yeah, I think so. Manchin's up in 2024, and it wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't run again. It wouldn't surprise me if he does run again, and I think it's possible that he could think about running for president in some capacity. Not likely, but I think it's possible.
You want to speculate on whether the current president runs again?
I was wondering when somebody would ask that question.
Surely somebody would ask.
There's two questions, right? Is Trump going to run again? Is Biden going to run again? It took us to hour 40 here, or minute 40 rather. Look, I think if you ask Biden today, Biden will say, yes, I'm running again. If you ask any Democrat in Washington, they will well, first they'll go off the record, and then they'll suggest that the answer is probably less certain that he will. I think Biden wants to run for re-election. I really do. He's wanted this job for 40 years. He ran 3 times for president. He was VP for 8 years. He came to the Senate when he was 30. I mean, he's lived history. He's seen presidents. I think it's hard to walk away, really hard to walk away. But if the midterms go as poorly as they appear to be right now, and that is effectively a vote of no confidence, to borrow a term from the Brits, if that's effectively a vote of no confidence in Joe Biden's government this fall, the midterms, I think there's going to be enormous pressure on him from Democrats to come up with a quick decision. I really do. Before we go to questions, I just want to say real fast, there are books here, and that
yes, and we're going to have you sign a few of them too.
And exactly. I'm happy to sign as many as folks want. I'll be back after the event's over, so if you want to get a book signed, please don't leave. I'll be here signing books for a while.
Yeah, when you finish answering questions, we'll let you slip out, and then they can go out and.
And by the way, if you do like the book, it's really helpful if you post a picture of it and put it on your Facebook or your Twitter or your Instagram. That stuff works. It's remarkable. All right, with that shamelessness over. Okay, yeah.
I have 2 questions, so I'll give them both to you,
All right.
and you can answer them in the order
Okay.
you wish. One, how did you divide the writing?
Sure.
And the second one, so that then you can just go on straight till the break. Where do we find hope?
Yeah. Sure, I'll take the second question first, and I'll be candid. I think in the short to medium term, we're in for a period of deep political division. I don't see a lot of happy news on that front. I think in the longer term, I take heart from the history of the country, which, you know, is a story of incremental progress, but progress. And the fact is we've had enormous challenges in this country, including a civil war, including economic devastation, both of which are far worse than what we're experiencing right now. And the country ultimately came through it and grew from it. And so I do think that the sort of history of the country and the resilience of America, sort of goodness of America. There was a president from these parts who had a line about this. What did he say? He said, about the American people. He said, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America, right? Was that Bill Clinton or Martin Sheen, by the way? I can't quite remember. It all kind of, the 90s kind of blurred together for me. But no, in all seriousness, I think that that's the sort of happier, longer term news that we've always sort of grown as a country. And your first question about the book itself, Alex and I have been colleagues for 15 years. We worked together at Politico before the Times, and then we both went to the Times. And he and I have a very similar view of politics and news, and it was a pretty easy mind meld. What we would do was we would just do chapters, and he would do one chapter, I'd do the next, and then when we finished, we'd email the other what we wrote, and we'd edit the other and send them back and forth, and it was, you know, like Word documents. It was not more fancy than that, and we didn't really have major disagreements, so it was fun. Who else? Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Did you send them back and forth?
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, did you have to wait?
So we were flying the plane as we were building it because, you know, in 2021, the summer of 21, we started writing this book. We began writing about events that had already taken place, but we're still covering the events that are ongoing. So for much of the 21, we're writing about events that have taken place and reporting about events that are going on as they're going on, and then also reporting on previous events. So that was pretty hairy, trying to sort of both write and report at the same time. But we have some training from, you know, I've covered so many debate nights. I'm sure Andrew can relate to this. So many debate nights, we have to start writing the story as it's going on. And this was sort of a bigger version of that, where you're writing a chapter and the other half of the day you're reporting out a different section of the book. So, yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that it was difficult for you to know where to cut the book off.
Yes.
And I couldn't help but think, as you've been talking tonight, about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Week. And I remember as a little kid sitting in the backseat of my parents' car listening to James Dobson saying about how you really needed to hold your nose, conservative families needed to hold their nose, vote for candidates who would get conservative judges in, because that's how you overturn Roe v. Wade. So it's difficult for me to think of it as kind of a surprising event. But I was
Yeah,
wondering
sure.
how that Supreme Court leak and the things that have unfolded around that, how you see that fitting in with the narrative that you've been able to build.
So I think the last bit of news that we actually wedged in the book, and by the way, it was hard for us to turn the book in. Like our publisher was like bringing the jaws of life down the wall. You gotta turn in the manuscript. Like we needed it today, extracting it from our hands. Oh, no. We were like, every last bit of news we wanted to get in the book. I think the last public news event that we got in the book was Justice Breyer announcing his retirement from the court. So obviously, before the leak of the Roe decision. So yeah, I mean, that's the challenge you have when you're writing about history as it's unfolding is you got to stop it, and you just have to hope that between finishing the book and publication that the narrative itself is not going to be upended. And I think by that measure, I think this worked out pretty well. There's nothing dramatically different in how we finished the book that would have been changed by events. I mean, I do think if Roe is overturned, it could shape the midterms. I don't know if it'll, dramatically change the views of Joe Biden, but obviously it could shape the midterms. We were nervous about Manchin coming to some kind of an agreement on Build Back Better between turning the book in February and publication in May. That was kind of nerve-wracking. But I will say, the big thing is that, for a period, we thought that we turned the book in summer of 21 to try to come out for the holidays in 21, and thank God we didn't do that, because that would have meant turning the book in before Afghanistan. And boy, we would have had a different assessment of Joe Biden and his administration.
You might be on the remainder shelf already now.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, sir.
Hi. I have a question that's not really a horse race question, but more kind of in line with the title of the book in terms of will this pass? Yeah. But in all the conversations in reporting you did on the sort of private feelings about Trump, the man, and Trump himself and the party, one of the things that strikes me as a concern is that even if we don't see a 2024 Donald Trump run, is the potential for Trumpism itself to still very much still be there, and what the appetite is within the party to turn to, if not Trump himself, still a candidate that very much embodies a continuation of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big questions that is looming over both political parties is who are they and what do they stand for? Look, I think Democrats largely share a kind of center-left viewpoint, but the Trump era has enlarged the Democratic coalition to the point where it's almost unwieldy, because it includes like everything from actual socialists to Bush-era country club Republicans, some of which perhaps live in this city, certain neighborhoods, high-elevation neighborhoods. Anyways, I say that because the Democratic coherence, or what coherence there is, largely consists of antipathy towards Donald Trump. That's the glue that binds together today's Democratic Party, is a contempt, dread, hatred of Donald Trump. Because the party is now this massive coalition of very different people. The Republican Party is in sort of even more desperate straits, I would argue, because it's largely become beholden to one individual. And you've got public leaders who have contempt for that individual and would hope he goes away tomorrow, but they can't say that out loud because they're scared of their own voters. And that party is largely organized around a contempt for the perceived and real excesses of the left. So you've got two major parties in this country organized around largely, in one case, contempt for an individual, in the other case, contempt for the sort of set of policies or a worldview instead of a more organized platform. That's the kind of polarized moment that we're in, that's where we are right now. And I think the next 2 years, 3 years in American politics are going to be fascinating, because eventually the parties are going to have to decide what they're actually for beyond those sort of temporary way stations where they are right now. And just real fast, too, on the Republicans, I should say this. Look, I do think that there's great questions now, putting Trump aside. as to whether or not they're going to be a party of traditional Reagan-style conservatism or something more akin to a European-style nationalist party, right? Populist, nationalist, more focused on restricting trade and immigration, kind of a come-home America foreign policy. That's a real debate that I think is going to exist with or without Donald Trump. Yeah.
This is more of a comment than a question, but on a couple of occasions, you looked at things from a broader point of view than
Yeah.
a lot of the other books. For example,
Well, thank you.
In the
I'm not paying her, by the way.
January 6th riots, you didn't even mention the phone call McCarthy to Trump and all that.
Yeah.
Instead, you looked at what a lot of the senators were doing during that riot,
Yeah.
which gave a much better picture
Well,
to
thank
me
you. Yeah.
of what was going on, and I really appreciated
Well,
that.
thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say. Yeah, so as you probably have noticed, there have been a few books on Donald Trump that have come out and that are still coming out. And look, we encourage that. We, let A Thousand Flowers Bloom. We obviously love journalism and we love books, and I hope they all are very successful. But because of that, we wanted to do a different kind of book. I mentioned this at the top, and I won't repeat it again. But there's more to American politics than presidents. And that includes like Congress, which is a very important institution. And there's more to American politics than Washington, too. And we wanted to sort of get beyond Washington. When it comes to January 6th, the chapter we have on January 6th is largely my firsthand experience in the Capitol that day. And we just felt like that was a more vivid slice of American history than repeating the stuff in 5 earlier books about various phone calls between Ivanka or Kevin McCarthy and Donald Trump. I was in the Senate chamber when Pence was taken out of the chair by his Secret Service detail, and then subsequently I was evacuated to the basement of the Capitol with the entire U.S. Senate by the Capitol Police as the rioters breached the building. When I got to the basement of the Capitol, I came out of the elevator and I saw U.S. senators, many of which are well into retirement age, being like pulled and in some cases like jogging into the tunnels under the U.S. Capitol building. And that's when I kind of knew that this was a serious moment. I'll never forget Lisa Murkowski from Alaska striding through the tunnels, leaving the Capitol basement toward the Senate office buildings. And she takes her arm and she clutches it under the arm of Dan Sullivan, who's her fellow Alaska senator. And she says, "I've got my Marine right here with me." Because Dan Sullivan served in the Marine Corps, and Murkowski is saying in that moment, our lives are in jeopardy here. And that really is the moment where I realized, because we're in a submarine at the bottom of the ocean, we don't see what you see on TV or on your phones, these Capitol police officers being bashed, because we're inside. And so when I'm evacuated, I don't have a full appreciation of what's going on, how serious it was. And I just followed the entire U.S. Senate through the tunnels under the Capitol and tape recorder on the whole time. And I was not going to go anywhere else. And I just followed them to Hart, which is one of the Senate office buildings, and was there all day with the entire U.S. Senate in that holding room. That was history. And it was an extraordinary day. One more thing. You knew that they were making progress in getting out the rioters because as the day went on, the security guarding that holding room in the Hart building, it went from Capitol Police with sidearms to FBI with longer guns to DC National Guard by evening with semi-automatic weapons. So you could see the progression of the sort of firearms coming in, and it sort of captured how serious it was and how determined the Senate was to get back to that building and complete the vote. Anyways, there's an entire chapter in there on the 6th. So, yeah.
2 more questions right here.
I'm
2 more questions, we'll quit.
I just wanted to get your insider's
Sure.
view of what you think it's going to take to put a stake through the heart of both sidesism. I know it has its place in journalism.
Yeah.
When you talk to the young kids and you see the future, how do you see
Sure. So the question's about what's known as sort of both sidesism, which is sort of equally blaming both parties for the current political moment. Look, if you read this book, and I think you're going to find really tough reporting and honest reporting about both political parties, and I think So Democrats are not going to be happy with the version of events in this book, because as you get to the end, it's obviously not a very happy picture about Democrats. But the two parties are not equal right now, and I think we're pretty honest about that too. And I think it's important to be honest about that. I think you can still be a reporter and be a traditionally objective reporter and be honest about the challenges facing the country and what's happened to the two parties. And there are similarities, but there are obviously important differences right now. And one of the two parties is beholden to a twice impeached and discredited former president. Yeah.
I have a fairly open-ended question, but from your position and with the information that you've put in this book and that which you have beyond the book, I wonder if you'd just opine about what we've got coming up on the 9th?
Yeah. So that's a question about this Thursday, the first public hearings of the January 6th panel. Look, I think they're going to have more information than has been reported yet in public. I think they're going to have some audio and video that's going to be interesting. We obviously have audio in this book, and I think you're going to be you've heard some of that, and there's more audio to come from us too. So I think that'll be interesting this week.
We thank you for being here. Appreciate you very much.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. And please stay and grab a book, and I'll sign it for y'all.
We'll let him go out the side door, and he can walk up the aisle.
And don't beat LSU again this year, please. Thank you.
So be sure and get a book at the back. Wordsworth is our partner here, and you can get a book, and Jonathan will sign it for you. Thanks again for coming.